Chapter 9 is full of terminology and just some geometry basics. I'm going to start by covering points, lines, and planes, which is part of section 9.1. The two questions that I'm expecting you to be able to answer at the end and that I'll give you some practice problems on for this particular video include: what is the basic terminology associated with points, lines, and planes? And how can lines and planes intersect? Or how can't they intersect? So the first thing that you need to know is that points are represented symbolically by capital letters. Lines are represented symbolically by two capital letters or by a lowercase single letter. So if I have a line that looks something like this, and it has 2 points on it, A and B, I would call that line AB, so I would put the line symbol above it, or I might just refer to it as line L, lowercase l. A plane is represented symbolically by 3 capital letters. And again, just like with the line, they would be points that lie in that plane. Greek letters are also used to represent a plane. And so you've got to start to learn a little bit of the Greek alphabet. So some common Greek letters include beta, gamma, and alpha. Here's a more formal picture that gives you an idea of some of these representations. So for this plane, I could either refer to that plane as alpha, since it's got the alpha symbol down in the bottom right-hand corner, or I could just call it plane ADE, all capital letters because they are points in the plane. Also within the plane, we have line DE, which we could also call ED. It doesn't matter the order that we call them. And if I wanted to just use symbols, I would put the line symbol over top of those capital letters. I could also just refer to that line as lowercase l, since it's also labeled that in the drawing. So let's break this down a little bit more. Let's first look at this line. I have point A located on that line. That point divides that line into 3 parts. I've got the half to the left of that point, the half to the right of that point, and the point itself, because that point is not located in either half. The second figure that you see is actually called a ray. This would be called ray AB. Or I could use one-sided arrow with the capital A and B underneath of it. It's important to note when naming a ray that the first letter that I see is the end point of the ray, and the second letter is another point on the ray. A ray is different from a segment, which is the next figure that you see. This is line segment AB, so it's a segment, because you don't see any arrows on it. If I'm going to write that symbolically, I would just draw a straight line with a capital A and B underneath of it. So notice the distinction between the ray and the segment. The ray has the arrow pointing in one direction. The segment doesn't have any arrows. And the last figure here that we see is also a ray. But this ray is different from the ray that we saw up above. So I'm going to call this ray BA because the segment, the end point is B and another point on that ray is A. So the direction that we go in is important for a ray. This diagram that's located in your book on page 451 gives a really nice summary of what I just described. I think it's very important that you study this and really get used to the symbols, the figures, and the names. The last bit of information that you really need to have in your background for our class is the difference between parallel, intersecting, and skew lines. First of all, this symbol, which is just two vertical lines right next to each other, is the symbol that we use in mathematics to mean is parallel to. So up above in this diagram, line L1 is parallel to line L2, and that's how we would write that. Parallel lines and planes never meet. Notice here, they say the same distance apart from each other all the time, which means they're never going to touch. If I look at the center here at the parallel planes, the blue plane and the red plane are staying the same distance away from each other, so they're never going to touch. Intersecting lines intersect in a point, and you can see that in this diagram. Intersecting planes, however, intersect to form a straight line. So if you look in the center there, you see that line that is formed by their intersection. Finally, skew lines and skew planes are never going to meet. So they're never going to intersect or touch. That's a lot of background terminology for you to know. So I'd like you to take a moment and practice with that a little bit, just on the basic terminology, and then we'll move on to angles.